Thank you. Thank you very, very much. And dobry wieczór. This is my third lecture. It's also the one that is the public lecture. And I'm very, I've already said this, but I'm very pleased to be here in St. Petersburg and very excited to be taking part in the program of the European University. In November 2008, Queen Elizabeth II of Britain visited the London School of Economics. This was a month after the global banking system went bust and the major economies of the world went into a deep decline. Why did no one see it coming? The Queen asked a group of economists. A good question indeed. It's now known as the Queen's question among the cognoscenti. The Queen's question, why did no one see it coming? And the eminent academics who were there couldn't give her an answer. But they started thinking about the question, and Professor Geoffrey Hodgson, who's editor of the Journal of Institutional Economics, drafted a letter signed by 10 leading British heterodox economists, which tried to answer the Queen's question. And this is the answer they gave. And it's really the subject of my lecture, what's wrong with economics? Well, they said, economics had become a branch of applied mathematics with little contact with the real world, that mainstream economics entertained a highly questionable belief in universal rationality, the rationality assumption, and efficient markets, the efficient market assumption, that it was the narrow training of economists concentrated on inappropriate mathematical techniques and the building of empirically uncontrolled formal models which helped explain the failure of economists to give adequate warnings that the storm was coming. And this letter concluded that economists needed a broader training involving allied disciplines such as psychology, economic history, anthropology, and so on. And their point really, if you know anything about the history of the Second World War, that is the non-Russian history of the Second World War, that like the guns of Singapore, economics was pointing the wrong way. Now the British, Singapore was a British colony at that time, and they built the most brilliant, wonderful fortifications that all faced the sea, these guns, because they were expecting an attack from the Japanese Navy, but the Japanese came up behind, down Malaysia, and so the guns were absolutely useless. And like economics, they missed the enemy creeping up behind them. Their guns were not trained on this possibility. Economics, and I think the reason is very, very simple, and this is going to be one of the key points I want to make. If you look at the history of economics and the foundations of the subject, it was really built to repel the state. Economics was fashioned to repel state power, but it was blind to the encroachment of private power. Now, it's natural enough to blame economists when things go wrong. After all, the main justification of economics is that it's useful. I mean, there's no other justification for doing economics. I mean, if you want to just do very intellectual work for its own sake, you can do maths or you can do philosophy or something like that. But justification of economics is it should have some use. The Great Depression of 1929-1930 produced the Keynesian revolution, and that was the only genuine paradigm shift that economics has had since it started. But it proved to be only a temporary one, because and Keynesian economics was an attack on the uselessness of economic theory of that time in explaining the slump. And now I think, let's broaden the argument a bit. Economic theory is both endogenously and exogenously generated. Think of it in that way. One economist has made a useful distinction between the intellectual origins of a new theory and its public acceptance. A theory may originate in the desire to clear up a logical muddle, to fill gaps in existing knowledge, explain new data. All these, are important, in generating a theory. But its success, the success of the theory, really depends on how it impinges on the interests of the dominant section of society. In short, economic doctrine is inherently ideological. It's not scientific, it's ideological. The power structure dictates the choice of topics and the methods of handling them. In its assertion, I give you one example, that in a competitive market, the factors of production are always paid their marginal products. That was the key assertion of the marginalist theory. That explicitly set out to refute Karl Marx's charge that the capitalist exploits the worker. You can see here very much how the battle lines are formed. And one can give many more examples of ideological influences on the way economics has developed. The present discontent with the way economics is done and taught went back before the crash of 2008, 2009. Economics today is under more pressure than at any time since the 1930s, noted one author in 2003. The charge against it, he said, is extremely serious. Economics as taught in universities neither explains contemporary economic reality nor provides a framework for the critical debate of economic voices in democratic societies. A student movement for the reform of economics teaching started in France in May 2000 and spread to Spain, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The issues raised by the students focused mainly on the irrelevance of undergraduate and graduate economics teaching for understanding real economic problems. They were against, and I'm quoting from their manifesto, imaginary economic worlds being imposed on students. This they called autism and called themselves the post-autistic movement. What's the Russian word for autism? Autism or? Autism. It was the anti-autism movement in economics. The students singled out the refusal of economics to take seriously any approach to economic issues not based on neoclassical theory, and they were against its dogmatic teaching style that aims to indoctrinate rather than educate. The crash of 2008 has produced a widely supported demand for rethinking economics, with an Institute for New Economic Thinking set up in New York with a $50 million grant from George Soros, and a student movement which calls itself post-crash economics, or rethinking economics. They have their websites. You can see them there. What the students want is what they call a pluralist approach, with less maths, more attention to history, the history of economic thought, and to methodological issues. In other words, emphasizing that there are many different ways of doing this subject, and you shouldn't just accept the dominant paradigm. Well, it's difficult at this stage to say what a post-autistic economics would look like. Because economists themselves are at war. And consider the following clashing schools. I think I've got this on a slide, but I might as well write it out and go through them. First, let's take Chicago economics. That is basically the dominant Anglo-American paradigm. Agents have rational expectations. That is, they efficiently utilize all available relevant knowledge. There is perfect information, perfect competition, and complete markets in these models. The first means that they either know what is going to happen for certain, that is agents, or have mathematical probabilities about future events. As a result of these conditions, shares are always correctly priced, risks are always correctly priced, markets continuously clear, money has no utility. There's a lot more, but those are the main propositions, and they are the textbook. They're the textbook versions of undergraduate economics, Chicago economics. Why Chicago economics? Because it started really in Chicago, in the economics department of Chicago and one or two surrounding universities, and the people involved in the rational expectations revolution, like Robert Lucas and John Sargent, they won Nobel Prizes for their work. Now we come to the new Keynesians. And the new Keynesians have very little resemblance to the old Keynesians, but nevertheless they call themselves the new Keynesians. They accept that agents have rational expectations, but they drop one hard assumption, which is that they have perfect information. Agents have imperfect information. Markets can therefore fail, and there is scope for government intervention to correct these failures. So they allow a scope for government, and the Chicago school there is really nothing for government to do. But the new Keynesian models, because they have imperfect information, they're rational expectations but imperfect information. One favorite version of this is asymmetric information. So that there is some scope, especially in the short run, for government intervention to remedy either the imperfections of private markets, micro markets, or some failures in the macroeconomy. Now, these two schools, I would say, are mainstream. Why doesn't this black work properly? Maybe it does. Mainstream. But this one has been more dominant in the last 30 years. They can be called the freshwater and saltwater schools of economics, deriving from the location of the first, Chicago, on the Great Lakes, and the second, Harvard, on the Atlantic shore. So freshwater and saltwater, if you like, think of them that way. Now we have the third school. I think this has expired finally. What am I doing wrong? I'll take another one. Okay. We now come to the good people. Post-Keynesians. Now the post-Keynesians really start by saying, well, what did Keynes actually say? What did he believe? Because after all, we ought to allow genius to speak for itself. They correctly say that Keynes believed that humans behave rationally, but that the future is not just risky, but uncertain. In other words, uncertainty, not irrationality, is at the heart of Keynes's thinking about the economic behavior. And so he asked the question, if the future is uncertain, what would rational behavior look like? And it's not it's not the same as the answer given by the Chicago economics. It's not rational expectations, it's rational behavior. Uncertainty can't be removed by better information because we don't know, and in many respects we cannot know what the future will bring because our actions create the future. So it's not just a question of time t and then adding 1, 2, 3, 4 on to the end of time, and you know at time 1 exactly what the situation will be in infinite time, which is the way, the mathematical way the rational expectations people set things up. But you don't know. You actually don't know what's going to happen, and that's particularly important for investment. And of course, this uncertainty makes investment very volatile because you're having to make a commitment of money to some project which will take a number of years to germinate, and so you're carrying a large risk in doing that. And I mean, Keynes would say that this risk cannot be mathematically measured. Now, in Keynes's own system, money has utility. It has a lot of utility as a store of value. Whereas in the Chicago and in the new Keynesian systems, money has no utility whatsoever. Now we have this school has been completely marginalized in the last 30 years. Then we have the latest movement, behavioral economics. This sets out to theorize on the basis of how human beings actually behave, not how they're assumed to behave. In other words, you drop the rationality assumption. Let's look at how they actually behave. And it uses cognitive psychology to reach a momentous conclusion, which is that human beings are programmed to behave irrationally. They behave in ways which have survival value and social value, but don't conform to rationality as traditionally understood by economists. Some new Keynesians have taken up behavioral economics in theoretical despair with the conventional models. So I think this is a growth area, behavioral economics. Is it going to tell us anything very important? I don't know. Basically, they've finally realized that psychology has something to say, and that the psychological accounts of human behavior could be valuable and give you a much better, more realistic picture of what goes on in this bit of your body than these assumptions of perfect rationality, perfect information. So, I mean, it's obvious. A lot of behavior doesn't really conform to what we think of as rational, but it may have some value for the people, you know, for the people who indulge in it. It may have some emotional value. It may even have some survival value. Now, we now come to another school which has been quite noisy in the West, particularly. I don't know how well, what impact it's had in Russia, the Hayekians. And they're followers of Professor Friedrich Hayek, who is a contemporary of Keynes. He was a bit younger than Keynes, but he was a great opponent of Keynes at the time. They had a big debate, and Hayek was thought to have lost the debate, but he lived much longer than Keynes, and he finally got a Nobel Prize in about 1990. When Hayek was asked, how did you finally win your argument with Keynes, he said, well, I just lived a lot longer, which was a nice, gracious way of putting it. And in the end, the longer you live, the more likely you are to win the argument. whatever the argument is. Now, Hayek denied the validity of macroeconomics. He said macroeconomics is not a correct addition to economics at all. Economics is all micro. There's no macro because aggregates have no independent value. And you cannot get aggregates out, you can't think of aggregate quantities. The only quantities that are important for economic analysis are those that are individual, sorry, let's go back because there's something important about Hayek. Hayek made his name as an economist in his attack on Soviet planning in the 1930s. What he said was that the state cannot aggregate the dispersed information given by prices in a market economy, and therefore the state's information will always be less than that available to individual agents about about their own preferences, about what they want. And therefore, if for the state to sort of invent aggregates is really to distort the whole system of production because it's disconnected from individual decisions. And Hayek's attack on Keynes was that Keynes invented macroeconomics, and Hayek said no, there is no such thing as macroeconomics. They deny the existence of equilibrium, which is an important point at which the Hayekians disagree from Chicago economics, since the price system, as they see it, is a discovery system. So there can't be equilibrium. Prices are always discovering what the values, emerging values in the system are. But they agree with the Chicago school in deploring all forms of government intervention in the free working of markets. And that comes out of Hayek's original debate with the Soviet planners. A particular bugbear of Hayekians is fractional reserve banking, to which they attribute the excessive credit creation which led to the banking collapse of 2008 and 2009. What Hayekians really want to do is to abolish fractional reserve banking, so that banks must have full cover for all the loans they made, reserves of 100% against any loans. And they also would like to abolish all central banks, because they believe central banks give these guarantees to banks that enable them to, or encourage them to act irrationally. So they're a very important sort of strand, and they've always sort of been a presence in the economics world. But nowadays, if you're in an economics course, if you do economics course, how many of you have come across Hayekian theories in the economics courses you've studied? No?
In the early 90s, it was all.
What?
In the early 90s, it was all over the place.
Yeah, in the early 90s, of course, that was the time. Right, now we come to another branch of economics, and I'll ask the same question. How many of you do this? Marxist economics, which has made a bit of a comeback. After any crisis of capitalism is good for Marx. It doesn't matter what it is, how it comes. As soon as there's some big collapse, Marx comes back, because after all, that's what he predicted, isn't it? But there is an important point in Marx. Leave aside the specific predictions that Marxists make, which is that economics is part of the ideological superstructure of the capitalist system. It's not an autonomous scientific discipline. Its purpose and techniques have been developed in order to justify the exploitation of the worker. It's really as simple as that. And when you look at what's been happening to income distribution over the last 30 years, you say, well, you know, there's something in Marx there. We don't like the system to which his thinking gave birth or was applied in the hands of some people, but as a critic of unmanaged capitalism, he was really quite powerful. And he should certainly be on any economics course. How many of you do Marxist economics in your undergraduate economics courses? Yes? Yeah, one there. What?
In the 80s.
Yeah, in the 80s, that was the only, virtually. But now there's one. Well, I think it should be more than that. Now, we now come to...
In geography, they teach David Harvey.
Sorry?
In geography, they teach David Harvey.
Yeah?
So, like...
Yeah. Okay. But I can tell you, in England and America, you won't get Marx anywhere in your textbooks. Now we come to the last category, business cycle theories. These were very, very popular in an earlier period. And basically, business cycle theories were designed to deal with the gap between equilibrium models and reality. I mean, there was obviously a gap, because the economies weren't at equilibrium. And certainly, and therefore they were always going up and down, and so business cycle theories were designed to explain why there was this oscillation, which in some of the times seemed to follow a regular pattern. So, you know, there were different kinds of cycles. Kondratiev was one of the great Russian contributors to business cycle theory. And he had a 40-year cycle, and then there were others with a 5-year cycle, then there were monetary cycles, credit cycles, real business cycles. We have something called real business cycle theory, which is taught, but it's not really cyclical. It's just about shocks, you know, and shocks have some effects. So we don't have any cycle theory left, actually. And again, I don't know how many textbooks have a important chapter on business cycles. Maybe not. So here you have a whole set of things. This is the economics tradition. These are things that, you know, economists have been thinking about, some of them for many, many years, without necessarily any resolution. And all that's actually available is really this segment here. All the wisdom we need to know about economic behavior is contained in the models which are derived from these two schools. We, of course, have I've left out many others. There was a marvelous, I think, a marvelous book by a Czech economist called Sedlacek, and he wrote a book called The Economics of Good and Evil. I think there again, the ethical aspects of economics are very, very important. I mean, what is money? I mean, is money a good thing or a bad thing? What are the ethical implications of money? And questions like who is ethically more responsible, the creditor or the debtor? The creditor always believes that it's a moral duty on the part of the debtor to pay. That is, you know, a very important principle. But the debtor doesn't agree with that. So anyway, these are big issues. Now, so if you're to try and work out what a post-autistic economics might look like, here are a number of leading principles. Here are a number of guidelines. Now, I don't know whether I have set these out, but perhaps I haven't, in which case I'll go through them. Methodological issues, that's right. We'll go to methodological issues here, which are crucial. Unrealism of assumptions, which cuts off economic theory from the real world. For example, Paul Krugman in 2009, I want to quote him, "The economics profession went astray because economists, as a group, mistook beauty, clad in impressive-looking mathematics, for truth. Economists fell back in love with the old idealized vision of an economy in which rational individuals interact in perfect markets, this time decked out with fancy equations. Unfortunately, this romanticized and sanitized view of the economy led most economists to ignore all the things that could go wrong. They turned a blind eye to the limitations of human rationality that often lead to bubbles and busts, to the problem of institutions that run mad, to the imperfections of markets, especially financial markets, and so on and so forth." So that's Krugman on the unrealism of assumptions. Now, the second question is abstraction. And that's closely connected with unrealism of assumptions. Schumpeter called the Ricardian vice. There's, in his massive history of economic analysis, which I commend to all of you, it's only at 1,500 pages, but it does have a great deal of very wonderful material. And he identifies something called the Ricardian vice. The Ricardian vice is the habit, for the purpose of analyzing a particular problem, of treating as many bits of the economic landscape as given, and then piling up one simplifying assumption upon another until, having really settled everything by these assumptions, the economist was left with only a few aggregate variables between which, given those assumptions, he set up a simple one-way relationships, so that in the end, the desired results emerged almost as tautologies. I mean, this is the Ricardian vice of abstraction. A good example of this vice of abstraction, by the way, is the quantity theory of money, which treats velocity as given, output as given, and then states that prices vary proportionately with the quantity of money. And of course, they couldn't vary with anything else, since everything else is given. And that's one of the great theories. That is the main theory of money. So the third thing is equilibrium thinking. This is also poor Ricardo, David Ricardo. I notice his picture hangs, photograph, or portrait, by the way, hangs in your office. He is the author of most of what's gone wrong in economics. He's also one of the greatest minds of economics. But nevertheless, not only is there a Ricardian vice, but there's a Ricardian telescope. And the Ricardian telescope is simply to concentrate on the long run equilibrium and ignore anything that happens in between. And there's a vivid example of the Ricardian telescope in action in a debate exchange between Ricardo and another famous economist of the early 19th century called Thomas Malthus. You probably know him by his theory of population, but there's another side to Malthus. Ricardo wrote to Malthus, "It appears to me that one great cause of our difference in opinion on the subjects we've so often discussed is that you always have in your mind the immediate and temporary effects, whereas I put these immediate and temporary effects quite to one side and fix my whole attention on the permanent state of things which will result from them." There's the Ricardian telescope. Everything intermediate that goes wrong, you sort of ignore, but the long-run effects are what you consider. And Malthus replied to that, I certainly am disposed to refer frequently to things as they are, as the only way of making one's writings practically useful to society. Besides, I really think that the progress of society consists of irregular movements, not regular movements, and that to omit the consideration of causes which for 8 or 10 years will give a great stimulus to production, or a great check to production, is to omit the causes of the wealth and poverty of nations, the grand object of all inquiries in political economy. So what Malthus is saying is what happens now over 10 years is incredibly important, because that sets the future. You can't just sort of omit it all and then say, well, starting from some simplified assumptions like the quantity theory of money, to say, well, of course velocity changes and then production changes, but if you take 100 years, prices will be roughly proportional to the quantity of money, And Malthus is saying that's a completely useless view to take. And Keynes said all this, again, very famously. It's probably his most famous quotation. In the long run, he said, the quantity theory of money is probably true. But this long run is a misleading guide to current affairs. In the long run, we're all dead. Economists set themselves too easy, too useless a task if, in tempestuous seasons, they can only tell us that when the storm is long past, the ocean is flat. Now, this is not just sort of, abstract critique. I think Russia has never recovered from the rigid application of the quantity theory of money to policy in the 1990s. Well, let's continue with equilibrium thinking, because equilibrium thinking is really the royal road in economics. It runs from Ricardo with his abstract Ricardian vice and Ricardian telescope, to Walras, who invented the general theory of general equilibrium, to Arrow and de Broglie, who provided a precise, a very exact mathematical formulation of general equilibrium, and through to the DSGE models which are taught today. That's the royal road. Hardline rational expectations theory, as it's now taught, has abolished the old-fashioned distinction between the short run and the long run, which at least made some concessions to reality, by abolishing time. The economy is always in equilibrium, employment and production are always optimal, and so rational expectations theory is the explicit mathematical formulation of the perfect information and perfect rationality assumptions which have always been implicit in economics. Now we come to a fourth methodological issue, methodological individualism. And that's the habit of treating individuals and their choices and their decisions as the sole units of analysis. The economics world is made up of lots of Robinson Crusoes, all engaged in maximizing their utilities in complete isolation from anyone else. The total utility of the society is simply the sum of independent individual utilities. As soon as one replaces this, we might call it atomic hypothesis, with the much more realistic idea of the interdependence of social phenomena, it is apparent that the whole cannot be equal to the sum of the parts, and that there are lots and lots of fallacies of composition in economic life. Social science can't achieve the certainty of physics. You know, in physics you have a law of gravity, okay. a stone falls to the ground. You know, you have a formula for working out the speed at which it falls. But suppose the fall of the stone was influenced by what other stones were thinking about its passage to the ground. You wouldn't have a law any longer. But that is actually what happens in economics life. One's own decisions, one's own actions are highly influenced by what other people are thinking, as theirs are by what one is doing oneself. So the whole thing becomes quite indeterminate. And yet, economics always sought to base itself on physics. It always sought laws that were as hard as the laws of physics. In fact, they arose in the same period. As you know, economics starts in the 18th century, and its model is Newtonian physics. And that's what it set itself out to do, and it's never abandoned that ambition. And economists, as has often been said, suffer from what's called physics envy. If only they could get the certainty of physics, then they would be as good as physicists. And of course, maths envy is part of that, physics envy. Now, how is this relevant? Well, it's obviously relevant in financial markets. The metaphor of the beauty contest or herd behavior is much more useful than that of isolated individuals in understanding banking behavior. I mean, banks, they all sort of behave in the same way. I mean, what's very interesting is that when you have analysts, financial analysts, they all say the same thing. They all, they're all on the same bandwagon. It's not because they've all individually studied the fundamentals of prices and understand that prices measure these fundamentals accurately. It's that they're all looking to what someone else is saying. And Keynes had this metaphor of the beauty contest, in which you're all looking to see who someone else chooses as a beauty before you make your own decision. And that expresses something extremely important about economic life. And finally, my last point is formalization. That is the rendering of all that I've said in A, B, C, D in mathematics, or in equations, I would say. The great virtue of mathematics in economics is that it makes precise things which ought to be precise and which can be stated precisely. Its great defect is that it imparts a false precision to things which cannot and ought not to be made precise. It gives you a false sense of security, maths. Like physics. If you think that human society is like the physical world or can be expressed in mathematics, you get a false sense of security. Your equations, you can solve your equations, therefore you can solve the problems of the real world. But of course, your equations are set up in such a way to be solved. I mean, if you couldn't solve them, you wouldn't have them. One example is the mathematical forecasting models used by banks in the run-up to the crash of 2008 and 2009. And another is that maths cuts off economics from institutions, from politics, and very important branches of which ought to be important branches of the topic. Now I come to my last topic, which is economics and the state. And here I want to get a bit more overtly political. Economists have been quite impatient of methodological discussion usually. They say it prevents us getting on with our job of improving society. Let's put all this methodological stuff aside. I mean, it's rather like, we were talking, Maxime, about a process. Actually, I think we would beforehand. A lot of people they get together to do something, and they spend all their time talking about how they should actually organize themselves in order to do it. And in the end, they do nothing at all. And I think a lot of people think that about methodological discussion in economics. It goes on and on and on, and you know, and then in the end, economists find that they're bewildered and they can't really decide on anything. But I think the way one does economics is crucially important for how one sets about improving society, because most of these methodological decisions that were made in the course of the development of economics did have as their result, and probably as their object, the removal of the state from economic life. In other words, they had as their result a big strengthening of the defenses of laissez-faire against state interference. And you see how that works almost from the beginning with Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which is now regarded as a sort of the key foundational scientific text of economics, was actually a polemic against a group of people called the mercantilists. And the mercantilists were the reigning sort of pre-economists of the day, and they believed very strongly in state regulation of trade. And they had a particular purpose. They regarded wealth and money as being very similar, or rather as money as being wealth. And Adam Smith said, no, this is their great mistake. Money is not wealth. In fact, we now know money is wealth. And the mercantilists were right. But Adam Smith was able to refute them. But the main point is, he said, the government should not be interfering with these market forces. And he has a famous passage in which he says, the prince ought to be deprived of responsibilities which he is neither adequately incorrupt or competent enough to undertake. The prince is corrupt. The prince is incompetent. The state is no good at any of these things. The market is much better. Let's leave it to the market. That was the main thrust. Now, that's an ideological position. The answer is the state can be bad or it can be good. In Russia, I dare say it's terribly bad. But in some countries, it's rather competent. So these are often empirical matters and matters to do with institutions. They're not theoretical propositions that the state is always bound to be less efficient than the market. And yet it was taken to be a theoretical axiom. And Marx, I think, was very good in pointing out that economics is the ideology of the powerful. The powerful could be the state, it could be a state ideology, or it could be the ideology of people who control the state, whether they were capitalists or military people or whoever. They use the ideas that they need in order to maintain their power. Marx saw the Ricardian doctrine of the wages fund as the ideological justification for profits. And of course, he twisted the labor theory of value, which Ricardo had developed. It was a Ricardian theory, the labor theory of value, but he gave it another kind of meaning, which is that labor was then the source of all value. And that became the standard theoretical principle of socialist economics. Marx didn't want a stronger state, which he thought would always be a servant of the bourgeoisie. He wanted a proletarian revolution, which would destroy the bourgeoisie and would lead to the withering away of the state. And so Marx thought that economic theory should be read as a tool of power. Now, I don't accept that. I think there is, as I suggested earlier, something autonomous, relatively autonomous at any rate, about science. If we all believed, if Maxim Buyev and I believed we were simply tools of the people in power, and that all we were producing was justifications for the policies of the state, we would be very unhappy with what we were doing. We don't believe that. We believe that we do have, some independent, that the thought is an independent weapon which can have an effect. But I still think that Marx was partly right. Now, what's happened in the 20th century is a good point on which to end, because the 20th century gave the state a much enlarged function in welfare. The social democratic state ran from the First World War till the 1980s. Its ascendancy coincided with the depiction of the state in this period as a benevolent despot. I mean, this was the kind of view of the state which social democrats tended to have, and therefore its interventions were regarded as beneficial. There wasn't any real analysis of the reasons the state decided to do one thing rather than another. It was just thought that the state, if suitably advised by economists, would take disinterested decisions for the public good. And of course, why did the state come into this very prominent role in the course of the 20th century? Well, for two reasons. First of all, the market system couldn't provide continuous full employment, and it was subject to very severe depressions. And secondly, because of the inequitable and unequal distribution of wealth, which seemed to be generated by the market. So the state was brought in both to cure unemployment and to get a more equal distribution of income. Well, by the 1980s, this whole idea of the benevolence of the state was exploded. It was exploded in the academic literature by something called the economics of politics school, which rose simultaneously with a resurgence of the belief in the market. It's known as public choice theory. Now, this is something that perhaps you do come across in your economics. How many people do public choice theory? Well, public choice theory is the theory of the state. It's the theory of the motives and incentives facing the state in its different departments when it takes decisions. I mean, it could be the motives facing politicians, the motives facing civil servants. It's an important theory, an important branch of the subject. And it is actually a good application of mainstream economics, because again, politicians are seen as entrepreneurs in votes, and bureaucrats are seen as people who want to maximize their budgets. And so this is the dynamic that feeds political decision-making according to the public choice school. And the public choice school was used to discredit the social democratic theory of the state as, sort of benevolent, sort of despot theory. And that was essentially back to what Adam Smith had said, that the prince was inherently corrupt and incompetent. The ruler was corrupt and incompetent, wasn't to be trusted. His motives as the ruler were private. They weren't to do with the public good at all. The ruler was just really concerned to steal as much as he could from the public if he was not controlled in some way. And this was true of all rulers. And democracy couldn't really control it very, very effectively because it didn't know what was going on. So therefore leave as much to the market as possible and get the rulers out of the game. Hayek was on this side. And you see it in all the institutional reforms of the 1980s and 1990s. State functions and institutions like central banks were to be outsourced to minimize political motives. Public industries were to be privatized. Financial services were to be deregulated. The welfare state was to be trimmed and reduced as much as possible. Distributional issues vanished from public discussion. And so this successful attack on the social democratic state, as I say, was a return to Adam Smith. But now we're in a new situation. They did all, governments did all that the Chicago School and the post-Keynesians more or less told them to, and we had this great unexplained crash. The Queen's question, why didn't they tell us it could happen, she said. And so this brings us back to all those neglected bits of economics which were just thrown away, which were attempts to explain why great crashes happened, and were attempts to explain why income and wealth are distributed in the way they are. You may have come across a recent book by Thomas Piketty, which has given rise to a lot of discussion in our part of the world, French economist, who really aims to show empirically that there's been no shift in the distribution of wealth since before the First World War. That all there was a dip, and then inequality has just gone back to where it was in 1914. And his argument is that a capitalist system which is not heavily constrained by taxation always generates very, very large inequalities. And it's back to a power. It's back to a power system. It's not to the market, it's power. People who control production actually can pay themselves what they want if there is no countervailing force anywhere. And that's exactly what Piketty says has happened. And everyone now says, okay, what do we do in this new situation? Most essentially, says a recent book by Admati and Helbig, financial reform requires the political will to put the appropriate measures in place and implementing them. The political will. But where is the political will to come from? They all talk in the end about it's a matter of political will to make the reforms, and then you get the question, but who's got the political will to do it? And that is the unanswered question. So we're up, I think, we're at a junction where I think macroeconomic policy is up for grabs. Everything we thought was settled before the crash is now unsettled by the actual crash and the feebleness of the recovery from it. That poses a mighty challenge for the ruling macroeconomic doctrines, textbook doctrines. Textbooks will have to be rewritten. The macroeconomics of the future will have a lot more economic history in it, a lot more history of ideas in it, a lot more from other disciplines in it. It won't just be maths. People who are brilliant at maths, and you all are, I know, will lose some of your comparative advantage in the new macroeconomics, not all of it, but some of it. And when you've got to be prepared for that, because after all, what we're studying is life. Thank you very much.
Let me start with a question. I'm just curious, what does it take to believe that basically over the course of the 20th century, the stability of prices became something real? Because I think it's a view of Barry Eichengreen, but he says, like, in the classical model of the economy, you could always deflate the economy and restore the balance in the current account, by the way, in the gold-driven economy, or put it this way. But because of the labor movement and the greater increasing importance of labor market, the government had to deal with the full employment issue, and so the deflation was no longer an option, and that eventually led to basically increasing probability of bubbles, increasing bubbles, and stuff like that. So what do you think?
Well, I think he's absolutely right, and that's what explains what I call the social democratic era, which starts with the First World War and runs through to the 1980s. But that came to an end in the 1980s. It was partly the structural changes in the economy. It was partly deliberate policy. Governments in America and in Britain, in particular, deliberately aimed to weaken the trade unions and the labor movement by passing a whole lot of anti-union laws. They deliberately aimed to weaken the social safety net in order to get more flexible labor markets. They acquiesced in the decline of manufacturing industry because unions were strongest in manufacturing. And if they could get into a service economy, you wouldn't have a union problem in the private sector at any rate. You'd still have it in the public sector. So really, what they did was they deliberately tried to recreate the conditions that had made the gold standard possible. Now, they didn't actually go back to the gold standard, except in the European Union, where they did try, and they have been trying to implement what is in effect a gold standard, a rigidly fixed exchange rate, binding on all the member countries, which gives no flexibility for dealing with shocks, except in most cases through the intensification of unemployment, which is what's been happening. You have an example of trying to implement a fixed exchange rate system without having crushed the working class sufficiently to get them to accept near zero wages. And so what actually happens is you have just a huge rise in unemployment. I mean, unemployment in Greece is, it's 30, 40, 50%. In Spain, it's about the same. I mean, these are huge totals. 25% adult, 50% young people. And you can go through the Mediterranean. Even in Germany, which is very successful, you have unemployment of over 10%. Britain and Russia, I think, are not dissimilar at the moment, because what's happened in Britain is they have got unemployment down, but by putting people into very low-paid service jobs. And I think something like that must be happening in Russia. I mean, Russian unemployment figures are very low, aren't they? I mean, 4%, 5%. But I wonder how, what's there. I mean, you can always get rid of unemployment. I mean, there's no problem in getting rid of unemployment if you get everyone to accept subsistence wages in the economy. You can get rid of unemployment. You're not going to have any growth, but at least someone will be able to do something and get paid a bit, enough to eat. So something like that has been happening. I mean, that's a long-winded answer to your question, but broadly speaking, I think there isn't a real way of getting back to the gold standard days, because another mechanism mentioned by Eichengreen, which was very, very important in the pre-1914 world, was emigration. Mass emigration from Europe to the United States and to Latin America. These were relatively empty continents, and as soon as the pressure of deflation grew too great in Europe, millions of people just got on their boats and went to North America and South America. And these empty spaces are, they've mostly been filled up. And now, when people do start emigrating to look for jobs in Europe, they encounter very large resistance from people who already feel their jobs are insecure.
We see a very interesting evidence of data being together in every transaction and every movement of the use of the there. We're doing the bodies, functions, and pulses, three-part approach model. Sometimes they claim that with big data analysis, large computers and corporations can almost foresee the desires and intents, consuming urges of people even before the people feel it themselves. So, in theory, one could argue that the Hayek argument about no state, no entity being able to figure out what are the preferences point could be refuted with big data computing power and so on. At the same time, we're reading Huxley, or shifting towards Huxley society where not only the corporation but also the state knows everything about everybody and take a look at every transaction and take interest in every transaction and maybe meddle with it. So how this new reality would change various theories, state economics, different economics?
Well, I think I've often thought about that very question. Would it be possible for a computerized, a set of algorithms that could be so powerful that they would be able to encompass all the possibilities that were available to human beings and program all the possibilities that were available to human beings, so that a central controller would be able to manipulate absolutely every facet of social behavior in the desired direction? The answer is yes, probably, but then you would not be dealing with the human race as we know it. You would be dealing with something else. If that became possible, if in fact it became possible to scientifically engineer the human mind in the way that your question suggests, I think we're approaching the boundaries of science fiction here. And I think it's very, very interesting, that boundary. I think science fiction should be part of every economics course, by the way, because some of it, not all of it, because it's very, very intelligent in some of its anticipations. But it might be possible, but then what do you say? We have to have a revolt in the name of humanity or something. Whether human beings will ever feel that way, or whether we'll be in the territory of 1984 and George Orwell, I don't know. But it's a very ominous prospect. And I wish I could give you a better answer to that. I'd love to talk to you about it, by the way.
In our discipline, the usual criticism was linked to this sociological school of thought, which was popularized by Michel Calon and Donald Mackenzie from Edinburgh in Britain. And it's the fact not that economics already reflects what's going on, but rather economists actively contribute to the formation of the prices, to economic mechanisms. And the problem with economics as a science is not that it is an inadequate reflection. You listed all the usual criticisms. But rather that, for example, even the setting up of median price for strawberry on wholesale strawberry markets in Rungis in France next to Paris is done with the help of economics modeling and economics professors. And in this respect, of course, all the derivatives which put us into such prices in 2008, it's the creation of economists. One of them is sitting over there. He was working at the bank at the time. So right now he's a nice professor, just out of the frame. And I wondered to what extent these sociological criticisms that economists or economics as science has a performative effect rather than just a reflection of what's going on, to what extent this fits into the picture you're painting?
Well, it does have a performative effect, absolutely, because it sets up a model of reality which is highly influential. And this is quite apart from individual economists being involved in setting up markets. If you believe in this picture of economic man as portrayed by, say, the Chicago School, it affects the way you behave. I mean, you actually start behaving like economic man. There have been some studies done on students, and they've done surveys of students doing economics and students doing other studies, literary studies, history studies, and so on, and they've charted their attitudes to selfishness and altruism. And they find that economics students become more and more non-altruistic as their studies progress, and that students who are studying history or literature become more altruistic. Economists become less altruistic, and other students become more altruistic. In other words, they start behaving exactly as they're supposed to behave as economic agents, rational economic agents. And now, the interesting thing is this the effect of their studies? Or were they like that to start with, and that's why they chose economics? Which is why correlations never tell you exactly what you want to know. Is it because I'm selfish that I became an economist? Because I calculate every move? Because I calculate that I see drinking a glass of beer with a friend as an opportunity cost, which otherwise I could sort of, be making some money in that time, which is a typical way an economist thinks about things. Everything is an opportunity cost. And therefore, if you have a bit of pleasure, you're actually depriving yourself of the opportunity of getting that extra dollar or two. Now, do people become economists because that's the way they instinctively feel about life and have always done? Or are they made to feel more like that as a result of studying economics? I've had this argument endlessly with a very nice PhD young lady who came under my care at one time at Oxford in the LSE, and she's completely non-selfish in her actual behavior, but she believes you've got to be selfish. She believes in calculation down to the last item, and will always explain I say to her, why are we having this conversation now? Why are we talking about these things? She said, well, there's some utility in me having this conversation with you, because I might get a useful idea out of it, which I could then apply to maximize. So it is a form of utility maximization. And economists always feel like this. They always, and if you know real economists, it's always in the back of their minds, utility maximization somewhere. And it's not in the minds of other people. Anyway, it's a long-winded way of answering. I agree with you. Economics is performative. It does actually influence the way people behave.
I'm from Greece. I'm here as a master student, and I'm really interested to hear from you a comment about financial crisis in Greece.
Yeah, tomorrow. I'm going to talk about that, about what happened to the banks, and Greece is going to come into that. I'm sorry, I think probably I shouldn't embark on that now.
Yeah, let me tell you that tomorrow at 6:30 there will be a lecture by Roberts on banking regulation in the aftermath of 2008, so please come tomorrow.
I did, by the way, offer to have a drink with some people afterwards, but I'm actually out to dinner tonight, so we'll have to postpone it till tomorrow.
Yeah, let me ask you one final question. Nobody wants to ask another. It's a question related to have a discussion with Yulia the other day. So Keynes himself believed in, well, basically his writings predominantly about restoring full employment rather than growth. And on the other hand, we all now preoccupied, if you read Bloomberg, you listen to politicians, we're all preoccupied with growth and the dynamics of GDP. But probably if you look at it into the long run, like growth as such doesn't matter because you achieve some bliss level, and after that, why would you need like growth more than the growth of population? So don't you think that this preoccupation with growth is basically wrongly grounded from the very start? Well,
I think it's reasonably well grounded in, I would say, just as a matter of common sense. It's a reasonable aim in a world of great scarcity. I'm not saying that poor people are more unhappy than rich people. I mean, the evidence is that growth of GDP doesn't actually, above a certain point, doesn't make people happier. They think it'll make them happier, but it doesn't. The surveys, there's a guy called Easterlin who did important work on this and did cross-country analysis, which showed that, in fact, most people in poor countries were just as happy as people in rich countries. Of course, you can criticize it in various ways because they have a limited information set, and as soon as they start having a more extensive set of comparisons, they start wanting to have things that rich people do. But I agree. I think that beyond a certain point, growth becomes completely irrational when you compare it with the possibility of spending more time, on non-work. I mean, non-work. I mean, work. What is work? Work, says Adam Smith and the whole school of economists, is a disutility. Work is a disutility. It is designed to get you consumption. That's the only reason people work. It's designed to get them command over goods and services. And that stems from basic primitive economy. You grow wheat in order to eat. You have sheep in order to get wool for clothes and things like that. You have to work in order to survive, okay? That's the basic scarcity paradigm. Now, as soon as you have an abundance of things, why should you go on working? Well, then you get into the real question. Is it because people enjoy their work so much they couldn't imagine not working, which may be part of the answer, actually, for many people, or is it because they're insatiable? They want more and more and more and more, and they're not satisfied with what they've got. There's no point of surfeit. There's no point of satiation. It just goes on. And of course, advertisers are brilliant at creating this new wants the whole time. Your iPad Model 4 is not good enough. You have to have an iPad Model 5, Model 6, Model 7, Model 8, and they all, that goes on, and you feel deprived if you don't have these new gadgets for everything. And in order to get the new gadgets, you have to go on working. So, and that's growth. The iPad 7 is an item in GDP. Now, I mean the purchase of it and the production of it. So if you want more things, you've got to grow. And I think that's highly irrational for a rich country. We ought to be thinking much more about working less and enjoying life a bit more. Now, of course, we do a bit of that already. I mean, we do take longer holidays and so, but when everything's been considered, we don't work much less than we did 80 or 90 years ago. On average, it was about 50 hours a week then. Now it's about 40. It's just below 40 in some countries. So it's been rather short, rather not much of a drop. And it's, of course, work is more pleasant, university work is wonderful, and there's a lot of creative work around, maybe more. We're less beasts of burden than we used to be. Heavy work is not so much any longer. We have machines to help us. And then the machines do pose a problem, because some American academics in Boston have calculated that about 50% of American jobs are at risk of being automated. 50%. What are they going to do, those 50% who now do them? Huge social problem. And we're only at the frontiers of thinking about it. But growth is obviously a big subject for the future.
Well, I have another question, because tomorrow when you will be speaking about regulation and consequences after the crisis, I will have to post a lecture which will be parallel to your timing. It will be an evolutionary biologist talking about the social implications of genome mapping.
Oh, right.
So I can come and ask this question now, but please dismiss my question if you will be talking about it tomorrow. Then we'll have to get the recording and I will know the answer afterwards. I guess the question is about your knowledge of course, of Keynes and his life. I mean, after the crisis, the Medvedev government at the time made a big deal out of proposing to replace dollar as a main reserve currency with the SDR. And they claimed, of course, that if Keynes didn't die during the Bretton Woods preparation agreements and didn't have I forgot, the third stroke or the second stroke, he would have instituted the SDR as the main means for the new financial system. But because he suffered a stroke, basically the dollar was anointed instead. To what extent this is factually true, and to what extent we would have lived in a different economic system if he succeeded?
Well, on the first question, I mean, the first point, the stroke didn't make any difference. I mean, it was just the Americans are much stronger than the British. I mean, it was a power thing. They wanted the dollar as the reserve currency, and just as they do now, actually. And that's why they resist Chinese proposals to limit the power of the dollar. But on the question of what difference it would have made, I think it would have made a lot of difference. It would have, because really it would have overcome what in the technical literature is known as the Triffin dilemma. The Triffin dilemma is what happens to reserve currency when the country running that currency starts running into deficit. I mean, people lose confidence in the reserve currency if it's linked to a country's balance of payments. And that's what happened to the dollar in the run-up to the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. So you would have avoided that. I mean, you would have detached the reserve currency from the balance of payments of any particular country. And then you would have, but then how do you determine the creation of the reserve currency and its limitations and its distribution? I mean, you have to agree on formulae for these. These are quite difficult to determine. And no one's going to trust. You know, as the Americans said at the time, we're not going to allow some bunch of people sitting in Washington from Uruguay and sort of Kazakhstan to determine what happens to our hard-earned dollars. Yeah? So I think that political question is far from being resolved, but it would have made the system smoother and avoided these crises of global imbalances, which are still there. The Germans have this problem in the Eurozone. They're running a current account surplus, and that's forcing deflation on everyone else.
Is there any chance that there will be a globally powerful player which will put the question of special drawing rights as a reserve currency back into the agenda? What do you think?
Yeah, well, they've increased them a bit. Yeah, of course, there'll be another crisis or two. Then we'll get round to thinking about these things.
I have one question to explain the establishment facts about it. And you probably know that George Soros, besides establishing Institute for New Economic Thinking, and also giving big chunk of money to it, he also tried to revive, to come back to his academic roots and try to revive theory of his mentor Karl Popper, theory of reflexivity, which played this financial crisis. What's your impression? I know that some philosophers are very skeptical about it.
No, I think reflexivity is fine. It's just a sort of way of talking about herd behavior, actually. I mean, people start thinking the same, and then you get big deviations from any kind of equilibrium value. And then it goes, and the thing about being a successful hedge fund manager, which he certainly was, is you just get off the ship before it collapses. And that is really, I mean, that's really what George did, and he made a lot of money doing that. He said, I study these, I see these bubbles building up, I see all the unsound sort of trends that are going on, and I pump them up until the point when I judge that they're bound to collapse, then I pull out. It's what financiers have done all the time. Of course, they pump up false. Did you ever see that film, The Wolf of Wall Street? Has anyone seen The Wolf of Wall Street?
Yes.
Brilliant film. There it is, pumping and dumping, and George is a very high-class pumper and dumper. I mean, the guy in the film, whatever he was called, he was a fairly small-scale pumper and dumper. George is a grand pumper and dumper, and when he's pumping well, a lot of people get a lot of money out of it because he sets up really good philanthropic, causes. I think even the European University has benefited to some extent. And so he's a philanthropist. And if he was asked to justify himself, he says, look, on the one hand, I'm doing experiments in my theory of reflexivity, which have been fortunately quite successful, and then I'm using the money in order for my causes. Which are, on the whole, good causes of the open society. But pumping and dumping is the oldest technique, after all, in financial life. Sorry, was there some addition to your question? I do know George quite well, and I'm very, very fond of him, and I think he's a good thing. Let me say that.
Let's take one more question. Wrap up.
I'd like to get back to the issue of reserve currencies and dollar in this role. About 5 years ago, maybe 7 years ago, and since then increasingly more so, U.S. government plays with dollar transactions and tries to claim its jurisdiction over effectively anybody dealing in dollars. Beginning Bank, which was trying to help an American in Switzerland to hide their taxes, have no presence in the US, nevertheless, US got to it and made them bankrupt. US now claims that whoever acts against US foreign policies, dealing in dollars anywhere in the world, as these dollars ultimately make their way to the US forces the global bank system, which is dependent on the US, to seize those funds, to freeze them and so on. So suddenly, US trying to claim jurisdiction and sovereignty over every single dollar anywhere in the world. What do you think it's going to do to this reserve currency, which was supposed to be an ultimate matter of exchange and wealth preservation?
Yeah.
Suddenly it becomes a political lever.
Well, I mean, it all depends how far people think they're dependent on using dollars for their transactions. I mean, one of the reasons for the dollar being so widespread in use is that so many transactions are actually invoiced in dollars all around the world, and so people are paid in dollars, and then they transfer those dollars to their home countries, and then at that point there could be some interdiction of the transfers of dollars, but countries in a position to do so have always used their currencies as weapons, and as long as people are prepared to hold those currencies, then the weapon is effective. Now, at some point, they may think the cost of holding those currencies is that currency is too great. It imposes too many restrictions on what they can do with it, in which case they will try and go into some other currency. But there hasn't been very much choice. The Eurozone set out to challenge the hegemony of the dollar, but in fact only about 20% of global reserves are held in euros, and probably that's gone down in the last few. In fact, the crisis has strengthened the dollar rather than weakened it, and obviously no one wants to hold rubles. So I think, and you can't hold anyway Chinese currency because it's not convertible. So the dollar is really the currency, the default currency. And therefore it can really do what it wants, or the American government can do what it wants. And there isn't a huge movement to sort of reform it going on at the moment. There was a bit of a flutter in 2008, 2009. In fact, President Medvedev talked about, I mean, one of the most hyper-optimistic remarks coming out even from the Russian administration. He talked about Moscow replacing New York as the financial capital of the world. Remarks in that vein, but that's very far from being reality. So there we are. I think that it's still a mystery, though, why, despite the fact that America has been running such a huge current account deficit, there has been such a huge investment in dollars in the financial system. It is because there must be a risk of default, but yet the American people, the American Treasury can get away with paying 1 or 2%.
This notes. Thanks again. Thank you very much.